Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's the 13th of April. It's Thursday. Blimey. So the school holidays end on Monday 17th. We've still got a few days yet left of our holiday. I hope that whatever you get up to today, Thursday, in your respective countries, that you have a nice and pleasant day. I wanted to go over some basics in the art of storytelling that I just think would help remind ourselves of what stories are. I found I've encountered people online from the continent who write books or who write stories, and then you ask them, well, what genre is your book? Or what genre is your story? And believe you me, they can't tell you. I'm going to try and go through some basic elements and list the different types of stories. And you hopefully will be able to identify what you write. If you're already published, your publisher would have told you that this is going to be this kind of book. The issue is some people self-publish on Amazon, and I've seen a mismatch of stories out there. I'm not a fan of the self-published book at all. Self-publishing for me is always a last resort. And when I have self-published, like my last book, which was self-published, we had a professor who edited it for us. We had Umar Farouk Sissay, who wrote the foreword. And I republished some of my poems that were already in magazines here in the UK. And our book, What's the Seashell Said to Me, has already been legally deposited. And a copy has been offered to the National Poetry Library here in the UK. Now, so for a self-published book, that's quite an achievement, because generally in the UK, self-published books are frowned upon because you have aspiring writers or sometimes established writers who no one checks what you've written. So how are you going to get that book into a library? So I want to list the different types of stories, which would obviously, if you're going to write a story and you're going to write a very long story, it might end up being a book. But I want to list the different types. I'm going to name them, and then I'm going to come back and explain. So basically, I'm going to base my ideas on Book Beaver here in the UK, and their website. And I'm going to look at some of what the BBC has said. And I'm going to look at some of what the Open University has said. So you might write an adventure story, a classic, a crime fiction. You might write a fairy tale, fable, or folklore. There are different types of stories which are also called fantasy stories, historical fiction, horror, humor and satire, literary fiction, mystery, romance fiction, science fiction, thrillers, war stories, and sometimes you have plays. So some people, their book might end up being a collection of plays. Even in a play, you might have different types of drama, wouldn't you? Some books or stories are non-fictional. There might be an autobiography or memoir. A memoir is French for your recollections, your memory about something. I might say Ezekiel and I are writing an autobiographical story about his life and about his experiences of having a mental illness in Malawi. A biography is when someone else writes about you. Some books are a collection of essays. You might one day write a non-fiction novel, which I'm trying to do at the minute, or you might write a self-help book. So you often see cookery books or how to do this, or books in it. So those are the different genres. I want to look at the elements that might make up a particular type of story, or what you might expect to find in a kind of book that calls itself, for example, an adventure story or an adventure book. So, adventure novels whisk readers off to faraway places. Adventure novels, unlike fantasy ones, they tend to stay in the real world. Sometimes in adventure stories you have a crossover of other genres. A lot of children's novels can be adventure ones. Of course, you're now going to tell me about Enid Blyton books, aren't you? If, like myself, you grew up reading the famous 5 Enid Blyton books, you're going to tell me about the adventures of the famous 5, those children that they used to embark on. A lot of adventure stories appeal to our imagination. So they help children develop a vivid imagination. Tell me what adventure stories you read as a child. This is meant to be an interactive page, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. Sometimes you might have a classic. Some books or some stories might be defined as classics. That's because they have withstood the test of time. They've been around so long that we all know those books, we all know those stories, we've all read them. For example, if I was to mention Wole Soyinka here, if I was to mention Chinua Achebe, you're going to tell me some of Chinua Achebe's books. You must have read some of Wole Soyinka's books. We refer to these as African classics. Books that everyone, if you did your secondary school education in West Africa, you must have heard about these authors. You must have heard about Charles Dickens. If you studied English like myself at university, you must have read Great Expectations, or you must have read some of Charles Dickens' other books. Some stories are crime stories. If you're going to write a full-length book, you might have a crime novel. Crime can be anything from murder mysteries to true crime stories. Crime is a very popular genre, isn't it? And if you watch Netflix like myself, and if you watch Amazon Prime like myself, you must have seen some stories and books which have been made into films or docuseries. In crime stories, you expect some kind of wrongdoing. And then maybe there's a search for justice. Did you like Agatha Christie novels when you were young? Sorry, I shouldn't say that. You're probably younger than me. Did you like Agatha Christie novels back in the day? When I was younger, in my heyday, I used to like Agatha Christie mysteries. What genre of crime do you like most? I spoke about nihilistic crime, where the protagonist, by that I mean the main character, is probably reflecting on how they broke the law or their experiences with the criminal justice system, and they have made themselves the center of the story. Do you like detective stories? Do you like investigative crime series? You might have also heard about fairy tales, fables and folk tales. Well, if you're West African, this is going to be your forte. This is going to be your forte, isn't it? Because storytelling in Africa evolved from oral traditions, which were based on us being told fables and folklore. If I was to ask you what you believe in, are you going to start narrating a story that your parents told you? Is it going to be a fable? Often we see anthropomorphism in the stories, where inanimate objects are given human qualities and traits. Are you going to tell me about Anansi the spider now? Are you going to tell me about Anansi the spider? Tell us about your fables and folklore that you have in your country. How about fantasy stories? Fantasy, of course, indicates that it's something that's not real, isn't it? Do you dream at all? Are you a very good dreamer like myself after you had a lot of cheese? So fantasy books are probably the most popular type of genre. I got to tell you this, I was not a fan of Harry Potter, when it came out. I don't remember liking Harry Potter that much. It's grown on me though. I'm a J.K. Rowling fan now. I never used to be. Now, fantasy like the science fiction type, they're very, very popular. Do you watch Doctor Who, by the way? Do you watch any science fiction? They're very popular. I remember reading The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis when I was a child. In fact, one of my poems that I wrote is based on The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. When the children went off to Narnia. So obviously in fantasy stories, you're going to make up another world, aren't you? Often we talk about parallel universes, where you have a universe which might be our world, based on realism, where you'd have normal and ordinary human beings, and often maybe you have another world of aliens and other beings with supernatural powers. Do you write fantasy novels? If you do write fantasy stories, you're probably going to have much more luck in selling books or in getting published, because they tend to be very popular nowadays. Historical fiction. Now, if I was to ask you about historical fiction, you probably would be able to list a few books. I'm going to ruffle feathers here and ask you to name a historical fiction. My example will be A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. And do you know any where you write about something that happened in Africa a long time ago, or in Europe, or in the world? There are lots of historical fiction around. Have you written any short stories that are historical ones? How about horror? Horror. You're thinking of being terrified now, aren't you? So, horror stories or novels are some of the best-selling genres in the whole world. That's what I have heard from reputable sources. You're going to expect to have some kind of scary plot and characters in there, aren't you? Do you know about Frankenstein's monster? Do you? Did you ever read Flowers in the Attic by V.C. Andrews? Do you know any horror stories set in Africa? Another genre is humor and satire. You must have read joke books. Satire is where people try to caricature other human beings. For example, sometimes they're portrayed in larger than life ways. Did you read George Orwell's Animal Farm? You must have read it. Have you read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain? I remember reading that at university as part of American literature. Sometimes humor can be dark. It can be a dystopian satire. I'm going to look at that when we come to explaining what these genres are. It might be in another video because I don't want this to be too long. So, do you know any funny books? Any satirical stories? Do you write any? How about literary fiction? Literary fiction are the sort of books or stories that don't slot neatly into more traditional genres. Most literary fiction are character driven rather than plot driven. So, you writing about someone, a character, they tend to be quite introspective. And they're based on like the stories of a person about a person. So the character becomes the most important part of the story. Sometimes you read some books and you can't differentiate what between the genres. So maybe you might want to describe them as literary fiction. If I was to ask you about mystery stories, you will tell me what mystery stories are, don't you? They are a subset of the crime genre. They are a sub-genre. So you have crime fiction, and then underneath you have mysteries. So Agatha Christie did, she's passed. She did a lot of mystery stories where you have the whodunit. You have to try and figure out who committed the crime. So how about William Shakespeare books? William Shakespeare drama and William Shakespeare stories where you had mysteries. Mysteries are full of suspense. They usually keep the reader guessing until the last moment. Have you read The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown? Have you read And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie? Let me know what mystery stories or books you've read. I've said sometimes we have plays, don't we? You're thinking of William Shakespeare now. Plays are meant to be performed rather than read. Do you write romance fiction as well? Everyone loves a good love story. Everyone enjoys a good love story. So are you going to have characters that fall in love or fall out of love? Are you going to have same-sex relationships? Are you going to have about heterosexual couples? Age gap relationships? So, do you write romance fiction? I briefly mentioned science fiction when I was looking at fantasy. So science fiction is very popular, isn't it? It's often combined with fantasy. But science fiction look more at the laws of science. They're not as realistic as some other fantasy stories. 1984 by George Orwell. Now you're going to tell me a lot of sci-fi films, aren't you? You're going to start listing sci-fi films just now, aren't you? Sometimes we have books with anthologies. You might have an anthology that comprises short stories and poetry. So, the now unpublished book Out of Islam's Game Poetry was an anthology. It had some nihilistic crime stories, and then it had some poems by Yusuf Kamara. Do you write thrillers? Or have you read books and stories which are thrillers? You want to keep reading till the end, don't you? Thrillers, they're full of action and suspense. They often cross over to use different genres as well. They can have some elements of crime and some elements of mystery in them. People like to quote this expression, the eagle has landed. Now, the eagle has landed is actually a thriller written by Jack Higgins. Have you read it? How about war? Some stories and some books are based on war. Do you know any stories about the Sierra Leonean War? Do you know the bestseller by some Sierra Leonean girl that was based on the rebel war? Do you know the story about that Sierra Leonean girl? I'm going to let you guess the title and write it under this video. So, war is a truly formative experience. It has a fascinating effect on readers. So, war stories are often a subset of historical types of genres. There is also what's known as women's fiction. I say I don't want to use women's fiction, but I would name and explain it anyway. So they center on the experiences and actions of female characters. It's a controversial term nowadays because in the UK you would not hear it. You wouldn't hear women's fiction, it sounds like, something that's preserved for people that are biologically female, in it. But we need to talk about Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's books. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's books are mostly women's fiction. Have you read Chimamanda's Americana? You must have read Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Are you going to say our winning story was a woman's fiction by Dorcas? Or are you going to use the term neo-feminist? Young adult fiction. In a young adult fiction, you have to be careful not to bring in too many sex scenes. And you've got to be careful that it's appropriate for children between the ages of 13 and 18. Or for teenagers between the ages of 13 and 18. Harry Potter books, as well as being fantasy books, are also young adult novels. Autobiography and memoir. I'm in the process of writing an autobiographical story with Ezekiel. Self-published authors like to write autobiographical stories. They like to share their life, don't they? You've had an experience on the page about writing non-fiction, haven't you? You've just submitted non-fiction stories. A biography. There is a difference between an autobiography and a biography. A biography is when someone tells a story about someone else's life. So autobiography, you writing about yourself. Biography, I'm writing about you. Increasingly, we're seeing a collection of essays. Or some people, the short story might be an essay. It's mostly for academic purposes, isn't it? For example, if I want to write an essay on Syl Chinikoku's poetry, So, essays can be book length, novels, or they can be short stories. Chimamanda Ngozi wrote, "We should all be feminists." Have you read Chimamanda's "We Should All Be Feminists"? I'm going to call it an essay. Self-help books. Self-help books are quite popular as well. They try to promise how to help you to self-improve and to heal. There are a lot of American books like that nowadays. The example here is You Can Heal Your Life by Louise Hay. I remember the book How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. I remember that when I was younger, when I was in secondary school or something like that. I remember seeing that book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. I must say, reading it didn't help me make friends, by the way. So, in another video, I'm going to come back and look at the specific element of these different genres. This has already gone up to about 28 minutes, and I need to stop because people might start worrying about the data. Have a nice day, ladies and gentlemen.